Welcome, my name is Victoria Kettis. I'm a mom of two amazing kids. I'm also a manager and facilitator with FamilySmart. We are so grateful and to Johnny's Heart of Gold for their generosity in sponsoring this event. And we want to take a moment to share a short video with you to let you know a little bit more about them, who they are, and why they have chosen to invest in and support other families. Join me in watching this video.
Hi, my name is Dana Sursuris, and along with Alex Rasovic and Spencer Whalen, we're the co-founders of Johnny's Heart of Gold. Johnny was my son. We lost him at the age of 25 due to substance use. Johnny was a loving, sensitive young man who had a great sense of humor. He helped people, and helping people gave him a lot of personal satisfaction. He loved to give. He had a heart of gold. This is why we've started our fundraising efforts to support those experiencing similar circumstances with resources to help educate, navigate, and be along the sides of families and individuals experiencing mental health and addiction illnesses. We've chosen to support this event because we've lived through and seen the effects of mental health and addiction firsthand.
Our mission is to make a positive impact on the lives of individuals in our community by leveraging FamilySmart's programs and reach. We believe FamilySmart's approach will help be the catalyst to change that is required within our community to assist prevention and intervention. Although Dana, Alex, and myself may be the faces of the tournament, we have not had the strength and reach if it weren't for the many amazing community members, sponsors, volunteers, and supporters of our annual golf tournament. We are looking forward to this year's upcoming tournament, as well as continuing to develop a legacy partnership with FamilySmart.
Thank you so much to Johnny's Heart of Gold. We are so touched by their caring. So we recognize cultural diversity and respect the values, norms, traditions, and beliefs of you and your household. We know that every family is different, and how we take the information that we learn into our homes is very personal. So take what will work for your family and leave the rest aside. Now, if you are triggered during this event, please connect with someone you know or reach out for support to one of those resources that are listed on this slide. If you are in need, you are not alone. We care about you and your well-being, and this conversation can sometimes bring up feelings that we just want to make sure that you're reaching out for the supports if you need them. Now, this conversation we're having today is also informed by questions families have asked to us over the years, and it's really going to be focusing on the basics of substance use, kind of from pre-experimentation to casual using. If your youth is experiencing chronic use or addiction, you can connect with these same resources, and we're sorry that your youth is struggling. Without further ado, I would like to excitedly welcome our incredible panel with wisdom and all of the heart they're bringing to this conversation today. And I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves. So Cindy, let's start with you.
Well, thanks, Victoria. And I'm so very delighted and grateful for this opportunity to join you tonight, and extending thanks to Johnny's Heart of Gold for the investment in helping make this possible. I am a mom of two, and I have worked as a teacher and as somebody in a variety of health promotion related roles. And I'm really delighted to be part of a provincial project, the ABCs of Youth Substance Use. That's Ministry of Health funded, but in collaboration with the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Mental Health and Addictions here in BC. And I'm joining you from the official territories of the Esquimalt and Songhees Nations this evening. Thank you for the invitation.
Oh, thank you. Angela.
Thank you for having me, Victoria, and it's been a real pleasure to work with Art and Cindy through here. My name is Angela Lawerence, and I live and play and work on the unceded territory of the Tecumloops people. It's in Kamloops. I am a mom of two pretty awesome kids, very awesome kids, learning disabilities, ADHD. I'm a former educator, and I've been working as a youth substance misuse clinician for the last 20 years. It's unreal. So I have an amazing job. I get to hang out with young people who teach me something every day. So
Awesome.
I'm really, really happy to be here.
Thank you, Cindy and Angela. Welcome. Art.
Hey, Victoria, and all the folks on the line. Art Steinnman, delighted to be here, coming to you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, and appreciate them extending their canoe out and welcoming us. I'm delighted to be here. A little bit about my background. I've worked in drug and alcohol prevention and early intervention, brief intervention for many, many years, more than I want to admit. And currently involved with the ABC's Youth Substance Use Initiative, which I'm just delighted to be a part of. Prior to that, I was at the Vancouver School Board for about 15 years, where I co-developed and managed quite a comprehensive, rather unique approach to substance use prevention and intervention in conjunction with the Health Authority. Prior to that, I did some consulting around this area for about 5 years. And prior to that, I was an executive director of a nonprofit that developed print and video educational materials for parents and teachers and others. I have one adult daughter, 29-year-old love of my life, and I live in East Vancouver, and I'm passionate about this topic, and so pleased you're here tonight.
Thank you. Well, welcome to each of you and everyone out there. As you can see, we are in incredible hands for this evening. We've got a lot of heart, a lot of knowledge, and a lot of passion all right here in this conversation. So thank you. Art, I'm going to kind of let you lead us off.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And we'll have the next slide. Look at that, right on target there. So yeah, just a few background statements to say at the beginning of the evening. You know, drug and alcohol is common. It's in our community, it's in our society. So it's important to remember that the vast majority of young people will come through this relatively unscathed, maybe the odd small incident here or there. So there's many, many young people who sort this out without serious problems. We can have the next slide, please. And when we're talking about substances, just so we're clear, we're really including a whole range. So alcohol, tobacco, cannabis, illegal drugs, and prescription and non-prescription. And we just mention this because, you know, you hear about drug-free and we should be drug-free and we should teach our kids to be drug-free. And I kind of go, oh, wait a minute. What about aspirin? What about Tylenol? What about caffeine? Right? You know, like, I don't know. I get where that's coming from, but I don't think it's a terribly helpful term. I think it's more helpful to be more precise, and that is that substances are a part of our lives. I think we've got one more slide there. So this is what we're going to walk through this evening, and you can see the order of things there. And I just hope that there'll be some good and helpful stuff for each and every one of you. It's so tricky doing this Zoom work. I'm so used to doing this in a room full of 30 people, and I can see you and we can interact and maybe even hug and all those good things. So I'm sorry we can't invite you and get your input and dialogue with you. We have a few ways to try and touch base with you a little bit, and that brings me to the next thing that we want to do, and that is we want to think a little bit about your feelings as a parent when you think about substance use in kids. And we have a little poll that we'd like to ask you to just take a minute. And it's one of these deals where it'll come up on your screen. Just look at the options and click one box and hit submit. And after everybody's had a chance, we'll just debrief this a little bit. There's no tests, no right or wrong answers. Just jump in and click whatever appeals to you there. Thank you for participating. Okay. Let's see what happened here. Oh, look at that. Very interesting. So a couple of people saying, wow, I have no clue where to start. A lot of people saying, hey, would appreciate some ideas and resources. And of course, some of us are worried we might say the wrong thing. Makes sense. Nobody fell for the smart ass comment, I see. Okay, that's fine. And on it, or at least I think so. So some of you are feeling, you know what? I've actually done a lot in this, and I've thought a lot about it, maybe done some reading, whatever. Well, good on you. And you probably are doing some very valuable things. So we had so much fun with that poll. I'm going to throw another poll at you because I want us to just start to shift our thinking a little bit more now and start to think about what are some of the reasons that young people might get involved with alcohol or cannabis or other drugs. So here's another poll. Have a look. And again, you get to make one single choice and you know the drill. So please participate. Thank you. Okay, and here we are. Aha, very interesting. What's jumping out at me is at the very bottom where it says all of the above. And the reasons that we listed, that sort of social pressure from friends, experiment to handle stress, to fit in, same reasons as adults. And probably we could have checked that one as well as all of the above, because it's certainly true in many cases. So, okay, thank you very much for participating in that. And I just want to say a few more things about the reasons for use. If we had more time, we could brainstorm a whole list of reasons. Curiosity, boredom, to fit in, to deal with loneliness, to have fun, to experiment, to push back, to take a risk. There's all kinds of reasons. And if you look at those reasons, I don't know if you would agree with this, but when I look at those reasons, I don't really learn much about drugs. They don't tell me about marijuana and how it works on the body, or they don't tell me about what mushrooms do, or they don't tell me about alcohol. Those reasons, if you look at them, tell me more about people, how they feel, how they try to manage things, their emotions, their connections. So I want to just suggest to you, I don't think we have a drug problem. I think we have a people issue. I'm not going to call it a problem, I'm going to call it an issue. And what it is it's a challenge where how can we support our young people so that they're more likely to find healthy ways to meet some of those very basic normal human needs that we all have. And we'll say a little bit more about adolescence as we go along, but it's a very natural thing for young people to want to take some risks, to be curious, to want to experiment, to be part of a group. And alcohol and drugs can seem to meet those needs very quickly. And if their friends all view it as cool and exciting and with it, there can be some compulsion to get involved. But we also know that there are some particular risks during the teen years that we need to be very mindful of. So there you go. There's our my suggestion we reframe it from a drug issue to a people issue. And I think at this point, I'm going to toss it back to Victoria.
Okay. So Art and everyone, I'm thinking about our participants that are all out there listening and watching, and substance use is just such a big topic. It includes so much. It includes a lot of fears on our behalf. It includes our worries. And there's so much we don't know, and it can feel overwhelming as we begin this conversation. So I'm wondering if you can just walk us through the basics of the things you feel families would benefit from knowing.
Thanks, Victoria. I'm going to take the lead on this and share with my panelists, of course, just the vast wisdom that we all share here. I think, picking up with one of the polls, that this idea that we have to know everything about substance use is just false. So we don't always have to know everything about what a dietitian would know, but we know what healthy food is for our kids, right? We don't have to know how, exactly how a car works, but we can teach our kids how to drive safely, that sort of thing. So I think it's really important, as just right off the bat, that we see substance misuse, substances in general, as a health issue, which can be a little bit weird for a lot of parents, because they want to see it maybe as a disciplinary issue or a behavior issue. When we can reframe, we don't always have control over our kids, and it's going to be a big piece of the conversation tonight, is how can we influence our young people when when our ability to control the behaviors really kind of slipped away and slipping away increasingly. And how can we still be there for them and put ourselves at the center of, of their world, because they really critically need us there. Removing the stigma, that's another piece too. When we see substances through a health lens, we remove the stigma attached to it. So it doesn't become an issue of, well, you're not a good person, or you have weak will, or, there's all of this, substance use in my family. So it's just in my genes. It really does take a lot of the stigma out, because we need to talk about this in the same way that we started talking about sex and gender identity, or safety in all manner. You want to add anything, Cindy or Art?
I think you're touching on some really important things around stigma, and we're learning more about anti-racism, about sexism, about more inclusivity. There's a lot of issues where we're learning more and learning to be to behave in ways that are a little more helpful, more positive, encouraging, compassionate. And it's the same in this area. And it breaks my heart, frankly, to see the stigma that's associated still with substance use. As we go along, we'll probably say a little bit more about some specific things that we can all do, I think, to try and reduce that. Language is one, and how we talk about people who are engaged with regular substance use, how we talk about impairment and other issues. It's really important what words we use, and there's things that we can do to help people really appreciate that this is a health and social issue, and it's not a moral issue, and it doesn't require judgment. That's not helpful. What's helpful is coming alongside and supporting people, and empathizing and relating to them and with them. And one of the things that always astounds me is some people are so critical, sometimes adults are so critical of kids, and yet how many adults have their drugs of choice that they like and use, and maybe they're able to manage it and keep it reasonable, and that's great if they can. But it's a little bit disingenuous and unfair to be critical of one segment of the population because maybe their drug of choice is different from your drug of choice.
Yeah. Any thoughts, Cindy?
Well, aside from, just holding my hands up to go, yeah, amen on that thought. And I think it gets back to Art's earlier comments too about how we need to think about this in a world where substance use for millennia actually has been around. So, and Victoria, you very wisely used the analogy, or sorry, Angela, related to around how we talk with kids around sexuality or gender identity, right? This is just a fundamental part of growing up. So we have to give space and some effort and sort of move past this notion of it's got to be, the talk, or an emphasis on the risks and the scare tactic side of things, and to really come back to the person and how do we help our young person navigate this amazing world of ours, which includes substance use.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah. So this idea that we can shift the lens is one really important piece of the basics. Another really critical piece here, and that's why we're here tonight, is recognizing that as caregivers, we have a profound influence on our kids. And we can influence their behavior, we can influence their attitudes, particularly when they're moving into adolescence, despite some of that sort of real need for risk-taking and independence. We have an enormous capacity to instill our own values and to help them surface their own values about all kinds of behaviors. And no talk about substance use in our kids would be a good talk if we didn't talk about the quality of the bonds with our kids. So that's going to be another key piece tonight, and it is a very key piece when we're dealing with some of the basics of substance use in our kids. You know, Gabor Mate and Gord Neufield's book, Hold On to Your Kids, is still one of my favorite books to recommend to parents. And they say in that book that, you know, kids have an inborn need to find direction. So what direction are they going to take, and who are they going to orient to? And if we don't put ourselves right there in the middle of their lives, then they're going to, there's lots of choices, loads of them. They've got their peers, they've got a whole social media world, and we become less and less influential. And we certainly don't want their peer, we don't want them organizing their ideas around this topic with their peers, because they're equally as clueless most of the time. So yay, parents, critical to this, helping them navigate. Wow. You know, zooming out, sorry, Victoria, did you want to say something?
Oh, I just thought you were wrapping up. So I was going to say, when I think
Oh,
about these
yeah.
things, some of the things I think about is, where do they go from here? What are the trends that we're not aware of? Kind of that spectrum of use that we're always curious, because there's so much we don't understand.
Yes. Yeah, there are trends. Do we want to talk about that? That's perfect. So if I'd love to direct people to in British Columbia anyway, we've got the McCreary Institute for Adolescent Health, and every 5 years they do an adolescent health survey, just really comprehensive. And the last one, I'm picking up some stats from that last survey, which was 2018, and overall, this was really the lovely piece of that, is that young people are delaying their use a little bit, and they're using a little bit less. So that is all really good news. And there are some tried and true old-fashioned trends that are still there, however, and alcohol continues to be the most widely used substance. I like to, when I talk to youth, I like to talk to them about alcohol being a liquid sedative drug, because it's so ubiquitous in our culture, it gets called booze, it gets, you know, just beer and wine. It's really, like, what are we talking about here? We're talking about a drug that has a sedative effect, and it's in liquid form. And when we reframe alcohol in that way, it, you know, again, it's just shifting that lens a little bit. Cannabis use is still, it's there, it's common. There's common as in about 25% of students who've ever used. But again, students are waiting a little bit longer to use, and boys are using a little bit more than girls. So going back to alcohol, one of the key things that we know about the way that adolescents anyway consume alcohol is they tend to binge drink. So they're not very smart about how they use their alcohol. And girls tend to have a little bit more problem with that than boys do with the binge drinking piece. Tobacco products continue to be an issue again, but that's been slowly coming down over the years, and it's at about, as of 2018, was about at about 18%. The interesting thing that most of us hear, and a lot of the parents on who are viewing right now are going to know, that vaping has made a quite, it's as tobacco has done this, vaping has done this since about 2016. And we don't have, from the McCreary Center anyway, we don't have recent stats. That'll come out next year, I think. So we've got stats from 2018, so it's before the pandemic. Certainly students that I work with, some of their vaping actually decreased during lockdowns, but it increased dramatically when lockdowns were lifted. Prescription pills tend to be the sort of the fourth piece of that. These are often pills and medications that come from home. So it's just something to really keep in mind. Mushrooms, ecstasy, hallucinogens, cocaine, all of that is under about 5%. So I have other trends that I know from my own practice, but maybe Cindy and Art, what do you have to?
Well, I think you've summarized sort of the key findings as current as we have them, and that is 2018 data, a lot of that.
Yeah.
You mentioned COVID, Angela, you referenced it, and there are some national studies and other studies that show adults and young people were using more during COVID, especially with alcohol. But I guess the point is a couple of things. I like, if I can share with those on the line, 3 quick points about youth substance use. If a youth is engaging in it, not too much, not too often, and never when it's not safe. Not too much, not too often, and never when it's not safe. And not safe is if you're driving or operating a bike or a dirt bike or a motorboat. Not safe is if you may be having sex or if you're pregnant. Not safe is if you're in a large crowd. Less safe is if you are wanting to focus on a specific task. But all of that, you'll hear us say many times tonight, the ideal is to delay. So if you're 12 years old, 13 years old, and you're binge drinking every weekend, and you keep that up, I know where that trajectory is going, and it's not helpful. It's very, very high risk behavior. If on the other hand, you're 18 and you're starting to have the odd beer on a Friday night in a social setting, or if you experiment, if you try a little taste when you're 16 or try a little taste somewhere in your teen years once or twice, there's still risk. There's always risk involved. There's an incident on the East Coast of 4 young lives that have just been lost, and I have no idea what was involved. But I have wonderings. So things can change in a flash, even from occasional use. But the main thing is that if we can get our young people up safely into those later teen and even early 20 years, because the brain's more developed, we'll say more about that in a bit, then they're at much lower risk of ever having an alcohol or drug problem for their entire lifetime. So those are important things to keep in mind in terms of the prevalence. On the vaping thing, just really quickly, I've worked with young people who literally said to me, I had no idea I was going to end up hooked on nicotine. They started using it because they were using juices and they were being social and they're hanging out with their friends. They're just doing, hey, you got one of those? All right, let's all try. And then they buy one and they use it and it has very low nicotine. Then they use their friends that has higher nicotine and they get a bigger head buzz and they go, that's kind of cool. And it can gradually creep up where now they're using much higher concentrations of nicotine. And then one day they go, I wouldn't mind cutting back a bit. It's not that easy. There are kids that can't get through an entire classroom period at school without hitting their vape. And they do hit them, they sneak them here and there. But the tragedy, I think, is these young innocent kids who think they're just socializing, having a good time with some juice. it can progress. And I'm not saying this to scare people or be alarmist, but just trying to be realistic that there can be unintended increments around substance use. The other thing about vaping, very quickly, I was working with a group of youth a while ago, and I was going over some of the effects of vaping on the body, that sort of thing. And this kid puts up his hand in the back of the class. He says, we know it's bad for us. We already know that. I want to know how to cut back or even quit. And this kid was like in grade 10 or 11, and he'd been vaping for a year and a half. He probably went through some of that scenario that I just described, and he was done with it. He was sick of it, but he was totally hooked. So there's supports for people like that. There are quit now programs. There are other things that are available. But here again, this is why we want to be alert and try and support our youth at these early stages.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in the years that I've been doing this work, I mostly have had a really hard time getting kids to come in and get help to quit smoking. That was never really a thing. They enjoyed their cigarettes. I would I would go out to the smoke pits and schools and say, hey, does anyone want to quit? And they were like, no, that have the odd person that wanted to. And I can't tell you in the last 2 years how many students that have self-referred to me in the school system to quit vaping, because it has been that phenomenally impactful on their lives in a really negative way. So it's impacted my practice to the point where students who are vaping, it's really hard to tell what came first, their anxiety disorder or the nicotine. Were they feeling really low before they started vaping, or are they just going through withdrawal 24 times a day? You know what I mean? So it's been a real challenge. It's a problem on top of a problem. So one more thing about basics, there's lots of things we could say about basics, is that we often talk in, around substance use, who ends up, moving along the continuum of substance misuse or who doesn't. We talk about protective factors and risk factors. And no one's life is perfect in any way. And before I just mention some of these protective and risk factors, I want to emphasize to families out there, I work with families a lot who have messy lives. My life can be messy. Has been more messy sometimes, less messy at other times. And we all fall into these two categories on some level. So I just want to make that really clear, that we're not talking about being perfect parents here. But typically populations of people who move along the spectrum of substance misuse to some of the more problematic use tend to have more of the risk factors and fewer protective factors. So here's just a few. So some protective factors within the family context, because we can go into some depth around individual protective factors, but within the family context, poor attachment to caregivers is absolutely critical. Positive attachment to caregivers. Poor attachment to caregivers is a huge risk factor. Open communication styles in families, which is what we're going to talk about a lot here tonight. Emotional support and nurturing from caregivers. Clear, consistent, and well understood boundaries and expectations. That well understood boundaries. So I'm telling you what the rule is. Are you hearing what the rule is? So that high warmth and high expectation. Some risk factors, again, hold yourself gently here. Lack of parental supervision was a big one. So that feral kid experience, which was actually my experience growing up as a child. We were absolutely feral kittens. Had some positives and also some huge negatives around that. Poor attachment to caregivers, so lots of high conflict. So sometimes that sort of high expectation, low warmth piece really gets in the way. We're going to talk a little bit more, I think, about that. Low levels of support and nurturing, a lack of rules and expectations, temperament, untreated mental health issues, problematic parental substance use, which I work with children of substance misusers and people in recovery. So parents in recovery, I often work with their kids, and that's a tough one around working with that family to remove some of that stigma and that shame around that. Stress of any kind, racial, cultural, gender discrimination, has a huge impact on kids' sense of like how they can manage themselves and who they are and where they're going to get that deep support that we all crave. And of course, trauma falls into this. And I just want to qualify that really quickly, is that we can be traumatized and still not become addicted. There's no direct correlation there. Many of us, all of us, have a certain amount of resilience Often with trauma, it's not what the trauma itself, it's what happened after. It's the level of support that we had or didn't have in processing that experience, which causes the dysregulation, the deep, bone deep dysregulation. That's all I want to say about that.
That's all you have to say about that. So a few of the things I heard from you, Angela, were just that we don't need to be experts. And coming back to that resilience piece, what we do need is to be able to connect with our kids. And Art, speaking of that young man who said he wanted to quit, and we don't talk about that part. We talk about don't do it, but we forget to teach them that there's things they can do to stop. So how empowering is that for a young person to know that they have control over it? All of you out there who are hearing those factors, those risk factors and those strength factors, you're here, and that shows the high warmth. So I want you to be really super kind to yourself if some of those other pieces might be in place, but the fact that you're here means the high warmth is big already. So you've already become a stronger influencer in the positive than not. So thank you. So one of the things I'm hearing about the data is that drugs and alcohol are often tried by our young people before they graduate high school. The numbers are big. So what part does adolescence play in their experimentation with substances? I'm going to get into that adolescent brain and knowing that it's not. On that one.
Yeah, well, let me kick the ball off, and Cindy and Angela do jump in. So we know that we have human development stages, and one of them is the adolescent stage. And so what is going on? There's a number of things in it. A lot of it relates to brain development. And so the very front of the brain is the last part to fully form. We develop our brains from the stem forward. And the last part is the prefrontal lobe, the cortex, where we have what we call executive functioning. So decision-making, learning from past experiences and remembering what we learned from the previous experience, planning, making decisions, weighing options, some of those more sophisticated things. Those are not fully developed for our young people and won't be until about age 25. So they're doing the best they can with what they got, and they have terrific brains. One of the other things that's going on for them is the part of adolescent development is to take risks, and thank goodness it's there. Because what that means is they will take some risks in those years and they'll learn from that. And they'll get some of that out of their system, so to speak. And what's unfortunate is to see people in their 30s who are behaving as adolescents because they haven't fully developed socially and emotionally. And they're taking huge risks, but they've got a mortgage at stake, a family at stake, kids at stake, and the costs are really high. And the other thing about risk-taking, of course, is that there's opportunities for us as parents and caregivers. How can we help guide our kids to a little less risky risks? So tonight, we're sort of emphasizing the fact that using substances can pose some pretty serious risks sometimes. So how can we help our kids find other things? And, we don't know what'll happen if they ride their bike down the mountain. We don't know what'll happen if they go kayaking. We don't, life is risky, folks, and crossing the street can be risky. But some of these things are better outlets. So we know about that. We also know lower impulse control is a typical feature in the adolescent years. Something occurs to them, boom, they take action, act right away. They don't necessarily go through this thoughtful process about things. And again, these are all intentional so that they can go through these things and learn from them and formulate and become more balanced, well-adjusted, hopefully adults. We've all done it to lesser or more success, but that's kind of what's going on. And another thing we know is that substances can really powerfully activate the teenage brain, the reward system, and the pleasure centers are kind of on high alert. And the impact of dopamine and the dopamine centers is really can be very, very powerful, especially from certain substances. And so it's not surprising that a young person might think, wow, I like that feeling. I wouldn't mind feeling that again. And it is more true. I really appreciate what Angela was saying about trauma. There's not this simple black and white. If you have trauma, you'll do drugs. It's not that. But if you are in pain, if you are working through grief or other issues, and boom, you take something that just really kind of relieves that, it's not surprising that you might want to experience that again and again. So we also know that in adolescence, there's a huge shift to focusing more on your friends and your peers, and you're differentiating. You're starting to pull away from your adults in your lives, your parents. Now, that doesn't mean, and sometimes as a parent, I felt this when my daughter was starting to do this. I thought, oh, she doesn't want a thing to do with me. I better just give her tons and tons of space. Not so much. It's more how you do it. And I think, Cindy, you're going to tell us a story about this later, so I won't say too much, but don't ever underestimate how much your kids want you, need you, look to you, care about you. They may not demonstrate that. They may demonstrate the opposite of that sometimes. And one thing I suggest to people is in the teenage years, maybe dial down the larger family events and mom and dad and brother and sister, and we're going to all go camping, or all going to do stuff together. Maybe go more with a one-to-one. You know, mom go off with a son or daughter and spend some time, whatever, and just hang with them. Just listen. Imagine if your only agenda, if your only expectation was to go and spend time with your kids and listen and observe whatever you're doing, and try that, see what happens. I think you might find that your kids will respond well. And what can slowly begin to happen is they begin to kindle some trust with you in this adolescent phase. They trusted you as a youngster, for sure. But that all gets kind of turned on its head in the teen years. But you can slowly start to build some of that up again. And a lot of it has to do with giving them space and respect and treating them with dignity, taking them seriously, taking their ideas seriously, even if you think they're wacko, even if you think, well, that's not a very well formulated view. Well, of course not. They're growing, they're learning. So the other thing that's very important to understand is the brain is doing what's called neural renovations, or it's actually trimming the pathways in the brain. It's eliminating synapses or connections that aren't really being used so much anymore. And it's deepening and strengthening literally electronic pathways that are being used a lot. And all of this is for very important reasons. It's a type of pruning. And so how wonderful is it if we are helping our youth get engaged in, and it doesn't all have to be sports. Not every kid is into athletics. It could be music, it could be art, it could be cooking, it could be sewing, it could be nature, it could be doing things for other people. That's a huge service to help our kids learn and get that dopamine from volunteering or helping someone else. Mm-hmm. So there's things that as they do some of those behaviors, those pathways get reinforced and strengthened. So that's really exciting that there's all these little points that we can have some influence, but it has to be done in a not in a directive telling and pushing, and it's more guiding and coaching and coming alongside. Cindy, Angela, are there things that you'd like to comment or add to?
Yeah, I heard Art the expression of their brain's not quite ready for prime time yet, and I went, oh yeah, that's probably a good description. Another comment I heard from this education leader once was this notion and this good reminder that evolution would not happen without adolescence. So there was a lot to celebrate about the teenage brain. And, as I reflect on when my kids were teenagers, and I actually have to say it wasn't necessarily, no parenting experiences always joyful, but boy, there were a lot of really great opportunities just to be part of and witness my kids growing up. And some of them were a little less exciting than others, but they, it is a time to celebrate. Those times when you feel like they're driving me insane is actually, that's part of it. That's that differentiating. That's them becoming their own people and trying to just figure things out for themselves. And, I guess a very important theme of this week, as we talk more about mental health, is around empathy and kind of just that little pause to think about where they're at and what's going on in their bodies. For me, as a busy working parent, trying to deal with some of what I was seeing in my kids was like, okay, I just got to pause and remind myself what's going on in their amazing brains. And, don't tell them this. I don't think they'll be listening, but, I literally in the top of my jewelry box, I put pictures of them when they were babies. It's just a reminder of these humans that they are. So those moments when you're like, oh, it just sort of put it in perspective. So, yeah, my 2 cents.
Yeah, that's great, Cindy. Thanks.
I just have one thing to add. That's beautiful, Cindy. I love that idea of reminding ourselves what we love about our kids, especially when some of that messy differentiation starts to happen, because it can be really messy. And then not taking it personally. This time for them is it's not always pleasant, even though they might seem like they're having a great time all the time. In private moments, and I am in a position and a job where I get to share the private moments with a lot of adolescents, and sometimes they're sharing more with me than they are with their parents, which I hold that very dear. But I also, it makes me just so committed to supporting parents in building those bridges. But it can look really messy. And Dr. Bruce Perry, who's a child trauma specialist in the States, I remember really clearly at one of his trainings, and he talked about this prefrontal cortex development over time. And it's not linear. It's not like, oh, it's coming online. Art mentioned this wonderful word renovation. I don't know if anyone, I've renovated parts of my house. It's disaster. And so he talked about these dips, these leaps, and then these regressions that happen, these troughs, and then another leap, and then a regression. And it makes a lot of sense, because even with my own teenagers, I get to see, like, he got that last week. He got that. What happened this week? Or he would never have thought about doing that this last month. What? He's doing it this month. So there is this sense I have to remind myself that his brain is it's dips and troughs and waves, and it's intense. It's an intense time. Yeah.
But I like what you're saying about those ups and downs, and it's not linear. We do have to be patient. We do have to be compassionate. We have to remember that we were teenagers once too, right? Did any of us do goofy, ridiculous, dangerous, silly, stupid things? Well, I think so. Did any of us not? I don't think so. So we need to just really get a hold of ourselves, and we teach parents about self-regulating, about learning to manage our own emotions, so that we don't just react and come out guns blazing about, you said what, you're going to do that, that's crazy, what? And if somebody comes on to me like that, so strong, so scolding and telling me what's wrong with me and what I should do differently, my brain goes into fight or flight or freeze, and my behavior goes underground. I just go, well, you're never going to catch me doing that again. Doesn't mean I'm not going to do it again, but I'll be a lot more secretive about it. So it doesn't take us to a place that's helpful. And when we learn to manage our very strong reactions, we care about our kids so much. We want the best for them, and we don't want them hurting themselves or hurting anyone else. But we have to find ways to channel that so that kids see us as a loving, caring, compassionate support who's there when they need it, not on our terms, but on their terms. That's something they can work with. And you know, unfortunately, in our culture, we're socialized to make certain assumptions. And one assumption is that drugs are bad people do drugs, and we should tell people not to do drugs. Mm-hmm. Well, you know, think it through. I know I shouldn't have 4 pieces of chocolate cake in a row. But if I've had a tough day and I come home and there's nobody home, there's a honking big cake sitting on the counter, you watch me. I might scoff half that cake down. I know about nutrition. I know about sugar and fat and salt. But right now I'm in an emotional spot where I want to feel differently. And that cake's going to help me feel differently. So we need to be gentle with ourselves and correct some false assumptions. Having all the facts in the world about drugs isn't going to save our kids. There's a place for some objective factual information, absolutely, because a lot of kids have got misinformation. There's a lot of kids that don't know that alcohol is toxic. Every year, kids are rushed to the emergency room. Why? Because they guzzled a 2.6 of rye or something. Well, you know, fortunately, they usually get their stomachs pumped and they live through it. But, you know, that's harrowing. Well, you know, sure, we should be teaching people, young people, that that's actually a toxic substance. And having a little sip at dinner is one thing, but guzzling a whole bunch, we're not designed, we can't do that. So we need to have some information about drugs, but far more important is all these relational things. So it's around communication, it's around keeping the connection with your young person. And that involves a lot of us holding back and us listening and saying a lot of to whatever our kid says, and see where that goes, because gradually they'll start to say more and more, and gradually you might get into a really good dialogue about things. Any other thoughts on that part of things?
I like the expression. There's a reason we have one mouth and 2 ears. We should spend more time listening. And it's a funny story, actually. There was a day, and I remember this like it was yesterday, and I needed to blow off steam because it was a very messy stage in the life of our family at that point in time. And I ended up talking to this stranger, this senior who was out walking his dog, and I mentioned about struggles with my teenage child, and you know, this person I don't even know probably gave me one of the best pieces of advice I needed at the time. Was he said, you know, I nearly bit off my tongue till it bled when I was raising my kids through those teen years. And I thought about that, and it helped me, because not long after there was a particular incident, and rather than me doing what naturally as parents we might want to sort of have a bit of a freaked out response to, it was an opportunity to just sort of listen more, regroup, buy myself a little bit of time, talk to my partner, and figure things out in terms of how we were going to respond. So yeah, I was very fortunate to meet that stranger in the forest that day, because they had very good advice that I needed at the right time.
Yeah, that's great.
Well, one of the only thing I have to add to that, Art, is, and again, it just comes to what I am allowed and honored to do every day, is being able to listen to youth, and you know, it's not common. It's not a common experience for young people to be asked open-ended questions, or to have what they've just said summarized for them. Did I get that right? So that's another skill we're going to talk about a little bit later. Just simply to be heard is really quite foreign. And I'm not talking about even in really well-intentioned families, but in our culture in general. And even the way that they talk to each other. So it's life-changing for them to have that experience. And so I know if I can do it, and I'm a perfect stranger, imagine the power of having someone who really is connected to them to be able to do that, hold that space for them.
Well, I think you're touching on a reality that, you know, when you think about how can we parent better, how can we relate better to our kids, one of the things is we learn from our kids.
Mhm.
And so there's this notion in our culture that we're the adults, we're smart, we're older, we know better, and we're going to talk down to our kids and tell them how they should live their lives, and they very well better do what we're saying because we know. Now I'm overstating it a little bit here, but that kind of posture, that attitude of, and frankly, in fairness to us poor parents trying to do the best we can, there's a lot of pressure on us to be there, to do something. I've talked to many, many parents who have said, I didn't realize that I don't have to have the answer all the time.
Mhm.
I didn't realize that I have to know more and be the one to correct and tell them. Now I'm learning that I can say, you know what? I don't know. Sounds like you don't either. Where could we learn? Let's dig into this together. Let's find out more together. You know, we might do that around. If my kid asked me to help them fix their bike or something, I might do that. I might say, you know, I know nothing about bikes, but let's go online. Let's see what we can do. I'll work with you. But for some reason in other areas, you know, we feel, well, I need to know and I need to be the authority. And boy, I'll tell you, I've had the privilege to work with young people and do an activity where they respond to questions that parents wrote out in advance about youth culture, about drug use, about any number of things. And then in a safe circle that's carefully set up, these young people come and they respond to these questions. And the instructions to the adults in the room are, tonight you get to give the gift of listening. And we very nicely say to them, you can't ask questions, you can't interrupt, you can't give advice, you can't correct. You just listen to the youth. And I've done these circles where they go on for an hour and a half. And parents are spellbound. And at the end of the evening, they are saying things like, I've learned so much, and I can't talk to my daughter in the way that we are talking here tonight with these young people. But when I heard that young woman say what she said, it just sounded like my daughter. But it was so helpful for me to hear what she had to say. And the young people come up to me afterwards and say, I've never had an adult listen to me that long in my life. I can't believe that they care about what I think. Do you think they feel 10 feet tall? You bet they do. They're blown away. And they see the adults, they see the impact on them, thinking through their own parenting and thinking, oh, wow. And these young people, and you know what else? The young people learn from the other young people because they don't all necessarily know each other. And I've had a kid come up to me after and say, I thought I was the only one that had to get the younger brother and sister lunch organized, get them dressed and get them off to school because whatever. Well, here's another kid talking about the same thing. So, you know, you see these things and you begin to realize there's a lot of love, there's a lot of hope, there's a lot of possibility out there. And we're our own worst enemies sometimes. We mean well, but we jump into things and we're going to correct or we're going to have the answer. And sometimes the best thing we can do is just take a big breath and say, or tell me more, or what's that like for you? So those are some of the powerful things that we can all practice, and it works between adults too, by the way. So you can improve your marriage too.
Big breath right now, and I'm going to lean into. I'm thinking of all the things you said around the adolescent brain and the things that we may not be aware of, and just the idea that their job is to kind of push us away to figure out who they are without us. And what a profound thing when our child feels safe enough to do that with us. I think that's something that we can actually celebrate in ourselves, that our child does feel safe enough to push us away and figure out who they are without us. And I think when you talk about we were all kids once, and if we can just pause every once in a while and think back to what we were like, I'm always grateful that my kids didn't do the things I did. So thank you. But I also didn't go to my parents. I didn't talk to my parents about the big things going on in my life. I talked to my friends about those things. And as parents, we're so caught up on the knowing what's going on, and trying to get all the information that we forget to just sit back and do the listening that you so beautifully spoke to, Art. So I have had the honor of being hosting some of those circles, and it's quite beautiful to watch what goes on, the dynamics. And so in thinking all of that, thinking that our kids are pushing us away, figuring out who they are without us, leaning into their peers and trying to fit in and belong, and pruning away the things they don't need in their brains, that leads us to, as parents, what can we do? Where are the places that we can step in? And Cindy, I'm going to turn this over to you as a mom.
Sure.
Would love
Sure.
to hear your thoughts.
Thanks, Victoria. And actually, I'm going to start by saying, you know what, even at my age, I don't really like to be told what to do. It kind of makes me think, you know what, actually, no, I don't want to. So it's human nature, right? So I think we need to, another one of those, pause and reflect. And so what's that look like from a teenager who's trying to grow up and become their own person and figure things out? So back to your question in terms of, so what can parents do about this? I think, loudly and clearly, you've heard a couple of really important points so far. One is that we have a lot of influence, both in our own behaviors and our efforts to connect with our kids, to create that open space where we have a chance to actually listen and learn from them. And I'm going to pick up on what Art was saying too, because sometimes, parenting is hard. I don't know if anybody remembers, when you're expecting your first child and you probably rushed out and got all these books and reading, and I just made myself more and more anxious with this like feeling of, what have I signed up for? I can't do this. And probably again around adolescence, we start to feel that same way. And then we worry about, now I've got to think about things like substance use, and I don't know enough about this stuff. And so, I think honestly, and this is not a joke. I think I learned a lot from my kids about some of their experiences, including decisions that they made that either put themselves in risky situations, or decisions they made where in fact they looked after each other, they looked after their friends. And I would have known that if I hadn't had time, didn't take the time to sort of resist that writing reflex, that you just want to make it safe, and then you just want to ground them for the rest of their life till they're 25 and their brain is fully developed. Well, the reality is that's not going to work. They'll call your bluff on that in no time. But that hitting the pause button and to listen. And I'll use an example of one experience I had, and then I'm going to tell this little story that Art alluded to earlier. But it was in a situation where my child there was some deceit involved, and there was definitely some risk taking, and there was some substance use, and there was off the beaten path in the middle of nowhere, and no lack of transit, et cetera. And so all the reasons that, even as I share this, my shoulders start to tighten because I think about what I felt at that time. But there was a little bit of a window between when we heard this and when we were actually picking up our child from this overnight sleepover thing. And so we sort of, my husband and I, we sort of checked in and we compared notes around, how do we want to talk about this? And I said, this is a chance for us. This is a listening and learning opportunity. So let's start with, tell me more. And we heard our child's perspective of what happened. We asked a few other clarifying kinds of questions. And then it was our chance to say, well, here's how we're feeling. And first of all, we're really, we're concerned about the safety factor. And I think, at some point, we just always have to remind ourselves, it is about safety first. We just want our kids to be safe. We love them so much. And, the risks that potentially they put themselves in. Well, that conversation actually did a few things in my mind, and for our child too. It gave space and it showed respect at a time when probably we really just wanted to oh, yeah, you're grounded and etc. But it helped us learn a little bit about what was going on in her head and how she was thinking things through or not. But some things that we hadn't thought about and related to sort of safety planning that she had shared with us in the conversation. And whether she did that or not in the actual moment, the fact is it came up in conversation with us that tells me, okay, well, that's another tool in her toolbox, right? So it became this conversation that demonstrated not only that we care about you, we're concerned about your safety, and just giving space for her to have a voice, but it also, I think, reinforced safety concerns, how to reduce those potential risks where things might have gone sideways. And for the record, it also ended in the consequence of her losing her phone for a week, which is like you losing, both hands. But even that was a consensus. That was us saying, here's what we think is reasonable. And if there was an acknowledgement from her, she's like, yeah, me too. So, wow, that's pretty powerful. So that's a little story to demonstrate that, as much as our listeners may be going, well, yeah, but I don't have time to listen. Well, there's a real life example where listening, I think, really helps shift things. And this was a dynamic in a relationship where there was a lot of this, at least between me and my daughter. Again, from a place of deep love, but adolescent angst, and it's probably because we're wired the same way. And it actually drew us closer, because it wasn't long after then I was having conversations about other stuff that she came to me to say, you know what, I really want to talk about something, right? So, and so while tonight's focus is around substance use, I hope our listeners are definitely getting the feeling that we might be talking about substance use tonight, but really this is about so much more. So I'm going to get to that little story now. This really relates back to this notion of adolescent development, and perhaps another reminder to help us reframe as we're going through those adolescent angst moments ourselves, perhaps. Cats and dogs. As I think about my children's high school experiences, I realize that young children are more like dogs, while teenagers behave more like cats. And I have them both, just for the record. Dogs are so eager, so loyal and affectionate. It's so easy to be a dog owner. You feed them, you train them, you maybe boss them around a bit. They put their heads on your knee and gaze at you as if you were the most beautiful painting. They bound indoors with enthusiasm when you call out. Then, around 12 or 13, your adoring little puppy turns into a big old cat. And when you call her, she looks amazed, wondering who died and made you queen. Instead of following you around, he disappears. You don't see him again until he gets hungry. And when your cat pauses in its sprint long enough just to sniff whatever it is you're serving, and when you reach out to ruffle her head in that old affectionate kind of gesture, she twists away, gives you a blank stare, as if trying to remember where she's seen you before. Might sound familiar. And you not realizing that your dog is now a cat. I think something must be terribly wrong with it. He seems so antisocial, so distant, sort of depressed. She doesn't want to go on family outings anymore. And since you are the one that raised her, taught her to fetch and stay on command, you assume that you've done something wrong. Again, maybe a familiar thought. Flooded with guilt and fear, you redouble your efforts to make your pet behave. Only now you're dealing with a cat. And everything that worked before now produces the opposite effect. Call your cat and it runs away. Tell it to sit and it jumps on the counter. The more you move towards wringing your hands in anxiety, the more it moves away. So instead of continuing to act like a dog owner, you can learn to behave like a cat owner. Put a dish of food out near the door and wait. Let the cat come to you. Most of all, remember, a cat needs your help and affection too. But you need to sit still and she will come, seeking that warm, comforting lap he's not entirely forgotten. Be there to open the door when he needs it. And one day, before you know it, your grown-up child will walk into the kitchen, give you a big hug, and say, "You've been on your feet all day. Let me do those dishes for you." Then you realize your cat is a dog again. It's a good little story. And as I read that, I'm like, oh, I am so living that, I can guarantee. So, and I think it's probably, hopefully, a little bit of a nice story that we can tuck in our brains as parents when things get messier, to use Angela's terms. So some of the other ways that parents can play a role when it comes to helping our young people navigate this world of ours where substances are pretty common belief. And I'll pick up, I mean, you've heard us talk a lot about a high warmth, but also expectations, right? So, that clearly articulating, having conversation about it. Here's what we're expecting. That's more important than you think. And there might be that motion. You're like, oh yeah, no, my kid doesn't listen to me anyway. But I think we underestimate our role as parents and the influence we have on our kids and the little voices that we put in the back of their heads that go, oh yeah, this is what mom was talking about. Another thing I'll pick up on is that notion of learning alongside. So, if you're walking down the street with your young adolescent and there's the smell of pot in the air, that's one, that's a very natural life learning opportunity to say, oh, what's that smell? And use that as a chance to maybe have a little, get curious about cannabis, get curious. It provides a little bit of a chance to say, what do you know about it? Or let's learn together, because you know what, I don't know much about it. So that notion of permission, and you use that word a lot, Victoria, and I think it's a really important one, is just permission to know that you don't know everything. And actually, when you express a willingness to learn alongside your child, it creates that space, and that, well, I can actually teach my parents something. That's kind of cool too, right? Versus being told what to do. So
Absolutely.
yeah. Maybe I'll just pause there for a second and welcome Art or Angela to weigh in, or you, Victoria, of course.
Well, you said a lot of really great things there, Cindy. I love how you asked your daughter, I think it was daughter, what was that like for you? Like, you could have jumped on it and said, what? You did what at that party? How dare you? We've told you not to. And it sounds like what you did is you took a breath, you got a bit of self-control first, and you actually invited her input, including, I'm assuming, how does she feel about it? Because you might save everybody a lot of grief right off the top with just a simple thing like that. Like, establish what happened. We know, and I don't know the details of your thing, but say your kid comes home drunk or whatever, the next day, we know when you came in last night, you were drunk. Do you agree? You do agree. So, okay, we're agreed on that fact. Now, we'd really like to know, how are you doing?
Yeah.
How are you feeling about that? And they may say, I feel really stupid. I feel really embarrassed. I can't believe I did that. Or they may say, I loved it and I'm going to do it again tonight. You don't know what they're going to say, but you're showing them the respect. So that's one thing that's so for me. And the other thing, when you talked about that little voice of the parent, in our home, we can set those boundaries. I totally agree with you. Be clear on your expectations. Kids want to know, what are you can call them rules if you want, the boundaries, the guidelines, what's okay in the house, what isn't okay in the house. Make sure they know that. But as you probably know, everybody, once they walk out that door, you really don't have control. But I want to encourage you that there's been research done that when kids are at a party in somebody else's house, no adults around, booze and drugs flowing, everything's going on. When they go to engage in a behavior, they often hear the voice of the parent. Because you've had them for years. You've been socializing them and raising them for years. And one of the things we haven't said too much about tonight that's so important is your role model. And if you've modeled even the first 12 years of life, don't forget how important those years are. The behaviors that you see in the teenage years are often based on the values and expectations and attitudes that the kids have learned in the first 12 years of life. And they learn that, we all know young children are sponges. They're watching mom and dad like a hawk. And they watch when you reach for a drink. They watch when you take an aspirin for your headache or you don't. They watch if you say, I've got a crashing headache, but I think I'm just dehydrated. I'm going to drink some water. Or I'm feeling kind of down. I think I'll call a friend and have a talk, or go for a walk, or have a hot bath. There's all kinds of things you can model that are helpful ways to adjust how you're feeling. Another way is to get drunk or to get stoned or to get high. And if that's how you manage it, they see that as well. So these are the influences that we have. And when they're out in the world and out at the friend's party and the girl they're trying to impress lights up a joint and hands it to them and says, here you go, they're actually very aware of what they've been socialized and taught in their home. And they'll be better equipped because of that.
I think that's a really good point, because I think as parents, we don't talk about it. often because we think that we're not going to have any influence. They're going to do what they're going to do as teenagers. But I know I have 2 kids, and I did have honest conversations with them, and it was amazing what impact that had. I think of even the influence, Art, you said something about having a glass of water instead of an aspirin, and right away Cindy had a glass of water. It was kind of cool.
Yeah, I know.
You're very
Perfect timing. You know, something else. Oh, sorry.
My son, I was able to share information with him and facts with him about, you've got a vulnerable brain because you live with some mental health challenges that if you were to smoke pot might impact you in a really negative way. And he was actually grateful as a young teenager to say, I don't want to be any more out of control than I already feel.
Right.
And,
Right.
and I have another one who you got to tell the things to, and she'd of course take what she wanted from that conversation of there's not any safe drugs out there, sweetie. They all have consequences to them. But kind of minimizing marijuana as this safer choice way back in the day. And so what she heard was, oh, so I can smoke pot. Like, so they are hearing us, and they are taking that information with us when they go out into the world. And so as I think about all the comments we're having, we haven't really gotten to that place where we were talking about their development, but I would love to get to that place of where we talk about what we can do beforehand, before they start experimenting. How do we connect with our kids? But before we do that, I think, Cindy, you had a video you wanted to be able to share.
I sure did. And I think this might, it's just going to make some of what we've been talking about come to light. So cue the video, please.
Okay.
It's just, there's all this pressure, and sometimes it feels like it's right up on me, and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless, and I don't know if it's going to stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever going to stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I mean, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
Yeah, see, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See, you're
out.
not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just... Sometimes it's like there's this achy... I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
Yeah, that sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you. Ow!
Oh, come on. If you would just...
Don't...
Try to see things my way. Do I have to keep on talking till I can go on? We can work it out. We can work it out.
Thank you for that.
I just love that. I love that video. So I love it. Every time I see it, I love it.
Well, the snag sweater line gets me every time, but it's a fun video that makes a pretty important point, which is, that what seems obvious to us and we just want to jump in there and fix it is not necessarily a very helpful strategy. And, rather, and as you saw signs of her friend trying to do that, is just, okay, I'm just going to listen and empathize. And there's a lot of power to that. So one other comment I want to pick up on before we move on to the next one, and that was this notion of what excites your child, what is the passion, what are the interests they have. Because, finding those sparks that bring us joy. And I don't know about you, but as an adult, when I know, I get to go, my way to relieve stress and boost my spirits and get some exercise, I go into the forest. And, that is probably just the number one best thing I can do for me, that I'm excited about it. I can't wait to go. I love all the hellos with the fellow dog walkers, etc. That's not going to be something an adolescent is very into, I suspect. Maybe not. But it's just sort of, finding out what really does interest your child, because with that comes not only a sense of confidence as you grow and you get to, my daughter, was a competitive soccer player. So that was a really good thing. First of all, it allowed her to run off some steam at the end of a busy school day. It also gave her a certain sense of confidence and agency, because she's a pretty skilled player. But also of interest was makeup application. And you know what? I can tell you, it was probably not the most joyful times for me to spend time talking about how to put makeup on, but I recognized that was really important to her. So all of which helps to just ignite those sparks in ways that also bring kids joy, which is, let's face it, part of why, as soon as we spun around for the very first time when we were about 2 and felt that funny feeling in our head, began life's quest to replicate that kind of transcendent kind of feeling, right? So finding ways to have fun. And then I'm going to related to that is this notion of risky play. And we haven't talked a whole lot about this in our preparation for this evening, but it's very much related, is that life is full of risk and reward. It's less about preventing the risk. It's how do you help them jump in and have fun, but just mitigate the potential for some harms along the way. So,
Cindy, that reminds me of something that's just come into my memory, of a study where young people who engaged in a lot of risky behavior, like intensely risky behavior. I'm talking about like problematic substance use and drinking and driving and property damage and things like that. Some of their long-term outcomes weren't great, but also the young people that didn't take any risks also had not the most favorable outcomes.
Yeah.
So there is that kind of sweet spot about supporting this natural desire that a lot of young people have.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I like the idea of going with what they're passionate about. You may not be that into doing the makeup thing with your daughter, but if that's something that fascinates her and interests her, be patient, work with her. And because I think of a good friend who did not want her son, like guns were a big issue in her house. She didn't want any guns in the house, not even toy guns. And she really made a big thing about it because, that was important to her. And when he got into his early teen years, he wanted to play paintball, big time. And she recognized that this was something that his friends were into and that he was passionate about. And so she rolled with it. And he did that for quite a while, quite a few years, but it ended up being actually a really positive experience. And there's a lot of good things that came out of that, but she had to set aside her personal beliefs that she didn't want him ever pointing something at somebody and pulling a trigger, even if it's only paint. So these are things, you're right, the kids that take no risks at all, that's not healthy either. And so it's about guiding them to healthier risks, I think.
Thank you. So I think about all of those things that we can do as parents. Thank you for that, Cindy, leading us into all the things that we can do as parents and step in and be aware of their passions and model for them and all those pieces. Now, going back to that idea of how do we connect with our kids before they start experimenting, to have those conversations so that we can give them the information prior to them taking those risks and moving in a direction that we're always thinking about and worrying about. We have about 5 minutes to delve into some of that.
Well, I think a lot of it is things that we have touched on already, and that is about your own posture and approach to them, being positive, being persistent but not argumentative, and finding ways to help them understand in an age-appropriate way. But it's not all about talk. It is about just spending time. It is about observing them. It is about listening to them. And then having those teachable moments, when you're out in the world or the TV's on or whatever, and things come up. But you want to be careful with that too. They'll sense a big 10-minute talk coming out of you long before you realize it, and that's not helpful. Lots of little short, little pithy things now and then is a lot more effective. The other thing to keep in mind is, thankfully, there are adult allies. There there's good research that shows if a young person has one adult outside of the home who they know has their back, cares about them, supports them, thinks well of them, they're at lower risk for a whole bunch of stuff. And if they have two adults, they're at even greater lower risk. And we've done this in schools. We've asked teachers to find a kid in the school who they see is starting to isolate. The grades are starting to slip. They're pulling back. They're not doing so well. Get alongside them once a week for 5 minutes or 3 minutes. Look them in the eye and say, hey, how's it going? How's your skateboarding coming? Whatever. Find some way to connect. Connect with them once a week and keep that up for several months and see if you notice anything. And that can be immensely helpful to those kids. So I remember one young girl telling us, because she was going to share her little plan for going back into her school after participating in some alternative program because of her drug use. And she was going to share this plan with an adult ally. And the adult ally, turns out, was a teacher who she'd interacted with once for about 6 minutes. He had intervened in an incident in the hall. I assumed that she'd been in his classes for 3 years and they hung out after school and they really knew each other. Well, not at all. She knew immediately that he cared about her and respected her and had her back. So I'm just mentioning all that because we're putting so much emphasis on us as parents and caregivers, but we're a community. We are parents and caregivers for the community, and we have people in the lives of our children, thank goodness, who can support us. I guess there are some specific things around not assuming, but checking in with kids, about not rescuing, but exploring, about encouraging as opposed to directing, celebrating successes, but having realistic expectations. Kids are going to mess up sometimes. They're going to not always do everything quite to the level that we might want. That's normal and natural. So celebrate when they do things well. And respect versus adultism. And adultism is kind of like ageism. It's when you talk down. It's when you say to a kid, "When will you ever grow up?" That's incredibly unhelpful. And instead of that, respect. And that's not always easy to do. Kids know how to push our buttons and they can get us going. But if we work at it and we get support from other adults, we can get a lot better at learning to diffuse things and manage our own emotions. It really does concern me how much as adults we tend to not take into account the youth's experience, their knowledge, their views. And the image that I have is an adolescent brain and an adult brain comes alongside and they walk together. So as a parent, you can do that with your own kids, and as a community member, you can do that with other young people that you know in the community. But it's the two brains together that is a good model. And it's not one over the other. It's not talking down. It's walking together, journeying together. And those are some of the things that what that does is it strengthens the kids' security. The ABC program that we're involved in, it stands for Autonomy, Belonging, and Competence. And those are things that we can help build up in young people. Autonomy is that sense of they have some agency. They can they get to make some decisions. Belonging, how important is that? Belonging at home, in the school, in the community. And competence, that sense that I can accomplish something. Look what I've accomplished. I can do certain things. Can't do everything, but it's a can-do attitude. And when those factors are in place, autonomy, belonging, and competence, kids are at much lower risk of, again, it's not just drugs. Because substance use is a compulsive behavior, but overeating can fall into that category. Workaholism, gambling, gaming. There's many things that we as adults and as young people can get involved in that are very compulsive and quite dependence creating. So that's also a good thing to keep in mind. Let's be humble that well, I don't have a drug problem. I've talked to adults who work 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, and they're bragging about how they don't have a drug problem. And I'm sort of going, yeah, well.
Maybe
think
some
maybe there's some other areas you could work on.
I know I would have finished the other half of that chocolate cake with you, Art.
You know, there's one comment I wanted to add to it, Art, is that
Yeah.
Something that we've not, I think, said explicitly, but I think is really important for parents to hear, and anybody else who cares about kids, is talking about substance use doesn't drive to behavior. Just like helping our child learn how to practice safe sex doesn't mean they're going to go out and fornicate away all weekend long, right? Lots of research to say quality sexual education, sexual health education helps prepare, and it actually reduces their problematic behaviors, right? And a young person once said in very wise words, they tell us to drink responsibly, but they don't help us learn what that looks like or how to do that, right? So I guess that's just my little reminder that, well, as much as you hear so much of what we're talking about has more to do with the person than it does about drugs, is getting back to that notion of there are some things that we can learn together. And it can start. A colleague of mine, she said on the weekend, her toddler or preschooler had a tea party, but rather than pouring tea, she said, "Mommy, would you like some wine?" And so that was a teachable moment for her daughter. She said, "Actually, I would really just like a cup of tea." I'm going to have, if I have wine, I might have some with dinner, kind of thing, right? So lots of teachable moments along the way too that we can take advantage of in good times, not in a lecturing way, but in a let's get curious together kind of way.
Thank you for all of those insights and those ideas on how we can do that. And I think about Art, when you're talking about ageism, and we're wanting our kids to be more responsible when we say things like, "Why won't you act your age?" when they really are. I mean, our kids are doing
Yeah, exactly.
And I love that we can, as parents, be allies, and it may not be to our own children, but it could be to our friends' kids, and being that caring adult that shows up in their lives in ways that have our children's peers have another person in their life to build that resiliency is always something that we can do when our kids are not wanting to. And just always that it doesn't have to be a lecture or a conversation, that it can just be an observation and being together. So thank you for that. I'd love to move on to, okay, we've talked about what we can do to kind of before they start and some of the things we can learn about when they're starting. Angela, I'd like to lean into you to kind of speak to what about our kids that have started experimenting, and where can we go from there so that we can support them in having better outcomes along the way.
Yeah, thanks, Victoria. That's what I do a lot of my life. And the way that I kind of organize my thoughts is I make lists. So that's part, my kids get their ADHD, very honestly. So I'm a big list maker. So I have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever. But I want Cindy and Art to just please jump in, and I'll pause lots, just so you know. But one of the things that I have the honor of doing here in my community is running, and COVID kind of blew this out of the water a bit, but it's coming back this year, but is running a program called Recognizing Resilience. And it's for parents whose young people have started to, their children or their nephew or just, an important young person in their life has started to use substances, sometimes experimentally, sometimes really problematically. So we have a wide range of parents in there. And, there's just one metaphor that has just stands out for me. This is the number one thing that I tell parents, and I share this metaphor, and it was a gift from a parent. And she really needed to view her expectations as a parent and all of the baggage that she came to the conversation with. And she had there was addiction in her family. She had a brother who was addicted. She herself was really strongly kind of believed in abstinence, and she was really devastated by the experimental use of her son. And what she came to pretty quickly, in her own way of just processing with other people in community, other parents, was that she needed to build a bridge between her expectations and her life experience and that of her son. And she really realized she had no clue what was really going on for him, because what was standing in her way of her connecting was her own reactions. And I loved this idea that she came up with, that this bridge needed to be preserved, and she was constantly bombing the bridge. And her bombs were the things that we as parents do in our anxiety. And that was criticizing, shaming, and blaming, and being apocalyptic about his future. And she was realizing that every time they had these conversations about his pot use, that was her MO. And she realized in this group that she was bombing the bridge all the time. And her son would become more and more secretive, more private, more sneaky, we call it those sorts of things. And sneaky behavior, in my mind, is about preservation. So I'm always curious about what's that young person trying to preserve. And anyway, we came up with this metaphor of don't bomb the bridge. And it was a wonderful way. We put it on mugs. So the number one thing is don't bomb the bridge. You have to really, really take care of your own reactions and really just be mindful of what you're bringing to this situation. And remember, Art talked about this much earlier. Most substance use does not become abuse. There's a big difference between experimentation and use and addiction, compulsive use. So big spectrum in there. We didn't even talk about the spectrum of use, which is, people do get benefits. Like our young people are getting some benefit from whatever they're using. So what tends to move people along on that continuum to more compulsive use is isolation. And that can be, you can live in a beautiful home and have that bridge bombed constantly. And you're going to be more and more isolated. So I just loved that. I owe her a great debt. Is anything coming up for Cindy and Art with that story?
There's lots that we could say, but I'm interested in what your other points are.
Ah, excellent. Okay. Second one is don't ignore it. And I saw this somewhere, and I'm going to say it, but when you put your head in the sand, your ass is going to get burned at some level. I know, right? It's helpful to remember that drug use of any kind has potential harms. Don't ignore this. This is a thing. We wouldn't ignore it if our kids were speeding through a school zone when they were first learning to drive. We would address it. We'd help them course correct. So the same is true for substance use, especially at that experimental stage. And hopefully you've had lots of conversations with them. Hopefully, maybe not. You don't have to. This is I've had experiences with parents that have bombed the bridge so many times, make that shift like this one parent did, and with remarkable results in the connection with her young person. But let them know there could be consequences. Consequences as in, like, it's a thing. So we need to talk about it. We need to, we're going to choose a time that's going to work for everyone, but we're not going to ignore this, right? And to have that expectation that they're going to delay their use as long as possible. And your reaction to a 14-year-old who's binge drinking compared to maybe a 17-year-old who comes home drunk is going to be quite different. But make it clear. Don't be wishy-washy about it. That you're going to address things at a good time, when everyone's sober and everyone is calm and people have their lids on. And we're going to introduce a video coming up here soon about keeping your lid on. It's a wonderful visual. And really explaining your concerns, that even simple experimentation carries risks. So 1 beer is fun and 10 beer can be toxic. And so, having some of those sort of teachable moments where they understand exactly what a drug is, and that it actually changes the brain, it changes how you think, it changes how you feel, and that carries risks. And I think ignoring it has them feel less important. So you being clear about your expectations makes them feel safer. That's, yeah.
And I'll just jump in quickly here,
in.
Angela, that, I do an activity sometimes with parents where we brainstorm, what's the job of an adolescent? Well, I do this with kids too. So take from age 12 to age 19, what are some things that are going to go on? Well, you're going to maybe get a driver's license, you might get your first job, you might have a love interest, you might do more advanced studies. You might also lose a love interest. You might also, there's all these things that happen in that short period of time. And then we explore, well, what if you overlay that with being stoned or high or drunk? Portion of the time, much of the time, often. Does that make any difference? And so just this point around, if we could all use substances and use as much as we want, whenever we want, never have any problems, we wouldn't be here tonight. It's not about the drugs. It's about the fact that you can, man, I've talked to young girls that have ended up in situations that, unplanned sexual encounters that I've talked to guys who have never related to a girl when they're sober. Don't know how. They always have to be drunk first. So these are, so you can go through some of those jobs and say, well, if you're babysitting the neighbor's kid and the neighbor's driving home one night and sees you drunk lying on the lawn in front of your house and you're 16, are they going to be jumping all over, come and babysit my kid again? Maybe not so much. So helping people kind of work through some of these things that, it's not demonizing drugs. It's more about, what are your goals? What's important to you in life? Where are you going? And how do you want to get there? And will substance use help you in achieving that, or might it create some issues for you? And I think the broad goal is to get safely up into adulthood where, for the most part, many people will have a bit of alcohol from time to time, or they might smoke a bit of cannabis from time to time. But that's hopefully a moderated, monitored use that is manageable, and that's different from excessive use in the teen years.
And I want to just add too, a thought related to, some of those other opportunities to learn that are less about the drugs, but have absolute relevance. And is, about 25% of kids who use regularly will say, I use it to relieve my stress. So, I mean, we all have stress, and actually, I heard somebody once say, if you don't have stress, you're dead, because life is full of those moments, and stress can actually be a really good thing. But let's face it, it can also be the kind of thing that makes us want to reach for whatever drug of choice as a coping mechanism, perhaps. I joke that my drug of choice is the running shoes in the garage mudroom, but readily can acknowledge and agree that every once in that glass of wine at the end of a really busy, exhausting day can also be shit. But I'm an adult, right? And I'm moderating that. So I guess this is a long-winded way to say, helping your child learn how to cope with what life throws at them is a really important life skill. It's one of those competences that we know that if we can help kids learn it, we're also going to be reducing the potential for problematic substance use as a way to cope with what life's throwing at them. So.
Absolutely. Well, and addressing, finding out that your young person is using and addressing it, it's choosing a good time to talk. Again, not confronting when if they're high or drunk, or when you are flipping your lid, which we're going to get to in a second. But having that conversation where you can be honest with them. It's okay to say that this is really hard, that I'm concerned about your safety, and this is really challenging for me, and I'm doing the best I can. And sometimes you might even have to take a time out, which I did recently with my 12-year-old son. I won't get into too many details, but yeah, someone brought a vape to his school and he tried it. And it took him several hours to get the whole story out, but he was uncomfortable from as soon as he walked in the door. And I knew something was up, and he just kept hinting at stuff. And finally it came out, and I had to take a deep breath. I had to go to the bathroom. I said, hold on, your dad's not home yet. Hold on. I had to go to the bathroom. I had to put my lid back on, because there was a part of me that was like, what? Do you know who I am? This is going to look so bad. I go to your school. I do presentations. I had to put all that back in, center myself, and come back and just really be there for him, because he put himself out there by being honest with me. So learning to ask that open-ended question too, like understanding, like try to understand what they're getting out of their use. Like all behavior makes sense to all of us. We wouldn't do something unless we were getting something out of it. So great opportunity to say, help me understand what you're getting out of it, because I'm not getting it right now. I'm either cannot remembering what it was like when I was young, or it might be different for you. Like mostly it might be different for you, because what my experience was as a young person is really vastly different than what my kids are. Oh gosh, there's so much to say. Oh,
So much to say, but we have about 2 minutes left.
I know. Oh yeah. Well, you know what? We should watch the video.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Angela.
One of the most rewarding experiences for me has been to study brain science and apply it to the experience of parenting. And the hand model of the brain that I use to teach parents is very useful to understand that. So if you take your thumb and put it in the middle of your palm, put your fingers over the top, this is a very useful model of the brain. And when we can actually see in front of us what's going on in the brain, then we can change what the brain does. So let me walk you through very basically what happens in this brain and the structures in it. And it goes like this. The spinal cord comes up representing the wrist, and then you have coming up into the skull the brain stem and the limbic area, which work together to help regulate arousal and your emotions and the way you have a fight, flight, freeze response. These are below the cortex, the limbic and brainstem areas, and the cortex is this higher part of the brain that allows us to perceive the outside world, to think and reason. And this frontmost part of the brain, right behind your forehead, so the person's oriented like this, is actually the part that regulates the subcortical, limbic, and brainstem areas. This regulation is very important because sometimes we can have all sorts of things happen in our life. We're tired, we're exhausted, someone pushes a particular emotional button, and we can flip our lids. So rather than being tuned in and connected and balanced and flexible, we can lose all of that flexibility, even lose moral reasoning, and act in ways that are terrifying to others, including our children. Now, you can actually bring yourself back online and come back to the high road and make a repair with your child, and that's important to explain to them. And you can also use this hand model of the brain to explain to children, even as young as 5 and 6, how to understand when their emotions are rising up from the brainstem and limbic areas here, and how it's overriding the prefrontal area and making it so they may be about to flip their lids. So I've had kids come tell me that they're about to go flip their lids and they need a break. They need a timeout. And by even just naming that, they can tame it. And that's the power of using the hand model for ourselves and our children to help us all make sense of what goes on in the emotional communication that we have in the course of day-to-day life.
Angela, I think it's pretty profound that you knew you were going to flip your lid. So you.
I knew I was going to flip. I was expecting, I'm 12 years old. Oh, I wasn't expecting that. That was a, the last thing I mean, there's so much more we could say, but it does take a village to raise a child. It takes a lot of different perspectives. We don't have to do this alone. It's one of the key things that comes out of the work I do with parents and the group is that, I'm not alone. And, I can get information and support from others, but also I can direct my young person, my kid, to go tap into aunties and uncles and grandparents and friends and neighbors and coaches. And as Art said, that extended safety net is such a critical protective factor. And if it all gets too much, there generally, certainly in British Columbia, I know there are viewers who are not from BC. I'm not sure, Victoria, if that's correct, or is everyone from BC?
No.
In BC, no, okay. In BC and in most provinces, we have drug and alcohol counselors. Substance misuse counselors. It's generally free, almost always, certainly in British Columbia. Who, if your young person doesn't want to see someone, fair enough, but you can see. I talk to parents all the time. I consult with parents all the time. And also, it's not necessarily a bad consequence for that young person to go talk to someone else and get some perspective on their substance use. And, I'll take students or kids, teenagers who are willing to see me, not willing to see me, whatever, just bring them in. We're trained in something called motivational interviewing, which is a wonderfully respectful, non-judgmental type of way of communicating. And I get loads of traction, loads of it. So reach out.
Thank you, Angela, for reminding us that we're not alone. Cindy, I want to give you 30 seconds is there any last final thought you would like to share with us?
I have a friend whose life experience reminded me, and it was an unfortunate ending, but she said, in retrospect, I wish I had made it more about the connection and less about the drug.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is such a powerful reminder to us all that you may not think about it as, a drug-related investment in your child, but boy, it sure is. And it offers so many other benefits. So connection, listening.
Mm-hmm.
Art, can you do it in 30 seconds? Your final thoughts.
Just, you're not alone. There's always hope.